Hello and welcome to Philosophy 111 Week 8, and this week we're going to be starting a discussion of some of the concrete and contemporary issues in philosophy of technology and science, and we're going to be starting this week by looking at the question of human enhancement and human enhancement technologies, or HETs as they are called. And our reading for this week, we're going to be looking at the essay Ideas of Perfection and the Ethics of Human Enhancement by Rodweit et al. And Enhancement Technologies and the Modern Self by Carl Elliott. And the latter one, as we'll see, takes a very philosophical approach and makes some interesting comparisons here. And I think, in fact, both articles have some substantive things to really get into in this topic this week. So we'll dive into these articles after a bit of background on the general idea of human enhancement technology. All right, so a human enhancement project is any modification aimed at improving individual human performance and brought about by science-based or technology-based interventions in the body. So the typical distinctions between non-enhancing technology or technology that is restorative or preventive, therapeutic enhancements and non-therapeutic uses. Things like gene therapy we've become familiar with. Ritalin is a kind of enhancement, the drug to treat things like ADHD, deep brain stimulation, DBS, and so on, and increasingly more interventions are being discussed as we go forward. So we'll talk about some of these. We'll talk about some of these issues in the when we look at the actual material. So 9% of people say they have used enhancement technologies, 9% of the population. And so this will include things like organ transplants, pacemakers, prosthetic limbs, medications like Ritalin and depression medications, and joint replacements as well. So 9% is quite a robust figure, and of course that figure is sort of growing and increasing constantly. All right, so some of the goals of human enhancement technologies we can really discern and separate, although they're obviously connected in important ways. I think we can discern at least four different goals that we can really look at. So, for example, the enhancement of cognitive abilities, neurotechnology and cognitive stimulants, brain stimulation tends to go into that category to improve cognitive performance. Enhance physical abilities, so obviously prosthetics, adding sort of prosthetic pieces to a physical body, modified biological functions as well, and sort of psychological modification, the third area, things like stimulants and neurotechnology as well, and lifespan enhancement and sort of the acquisition of non-human abilities is an interesting fourth category, with things like night vision technology, genetic engineering to increase immunity to disease and increase the lifespan, and so on. So typically these are some of the sort of areas where, when people think about enhancement, these are some of the areas that will count and people will sort of look at as sort of contemporary areas where human enhancement is a kind of viable project. So the traditional kind of human enhancement, things like, so we can start with things like specific practices, which are really sort of just forms of physical discipline, really. Things like meditation, yoga, kung fu and bodybuilding, and sort of just any kind of physical modifying activity counts as a sort of traditional form of human enhancement. Obviously, it's not using medication, although it is sort of stimulating through sort of rigorous training some kind of bodily and also mental change. Also things like natural substances with enhancement effects, green tea and coffee and ginkgo. There's a whole load of these substances that people make these claims for, of course, but things that sort of have some kind of enhancement effect. You know, caffeine is used in a number of products that is supposed to enhance alertness and awakeness. And so these natural substances are found in you know, a lot of kind of very popular for sort of solving you know, problems of tiredness and sort of staying awake and so on. Of course, there's a lot of controversy about whether, you know, it's a good idea to sort of use these things, whether you're sort of running down your reserves and so on. But certainly they're used as a form of human enhancement. And conventional technology that supplements a human capability. You know, telephone, for example, supplements our sort of hearing ability and makes it possible to have one-on-one conversations over long distances. The crane sort of extends our reach ability, of course. So we can think of, you know, those sort of conventional forms of technology as also enhancing. As also sort of human enhancements, that it sort of extends our human range. And so these things are sort of traditional, I guess, non-invasive forms of human enhancement, the sort of traditional forms that have always been around, more or less. So current things that are being that are sort of being discussed and that are a sort of are really a product of the last few decades, really. Medications like Ritalin and Prozac, and medications that sort of affect our sort of neurological condition, and so make, you know, sort of affect our neurological state, and so have quite potentially quite strong and severe enhancement effects, potentially. So, you know, medication has become a sort of popular form of trying to find kind of enhancements, and often they're sort of solutions to problems, lack of time, lack of you know, when people sort of struggle to perform work in the time they have available. You know, one of the things that enhancements do is solve that problem. But as we'll talk about, that's a social problem, not really. You know, not really an individual problem. So, you know, it's unclear what the long-term implications of that are. Anyway, we'll discuss that in a little while. Neurotechnology, of course, what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, neurostimulation, brain-computer interfaces, which is still kind of primitive, I suppose, but something that is increasingly being talked about. Deep brain stimulation. So again, all of these things are thought to have important enhancement effects, and are sort of used in a narrow range of treatments to treat certain neurological conditions. And of course, we've got sort of increasingly prosthetics, implants, and surgery, with sort of functional body modification and LASIK and other new technologies sort of extending the range of what's possible for prosthetics and implants. And finally, genetic or biological human enhancement, gene doping and steroids and so on. So there's a lot, you know, when we take a look and we see what's there, there's a lot of areas and a lot of different sort of parts of this that we can sort of investigate and take a look at, that really, you know, a lot of them are sort of related to the traditional forms of modification, but these forms that are currently coming online are, of course, much more powerful and much more far-reaching in their ability to alter, you know, our neurological state, or to sort of modify a physical potential that we already possess. All right, so of course the sort of future enhancements being talked about, nanotechnology now, we're talking about nanobiotech, nanobots within the immune system to perform specific functions. That's sort of being talked about in the medical community now, that those technologies might be coming online at some point. Anti-aging and health life extension, things like tissue engineering now is sort of adding to the sort of function of traditional anti-aging sort of research. Genetic engineering, implants and prosthetics, and of course the sort of the promise of cyborg technologies, that there will be some kind of symmetry of sort of prosthetics and biological functions at some point, with brain-computer interfaces presumably locked in there and playing some kind of coordinating role. And of course the sort of the military, the dream of the US military, the super soldier, the enhanced soldier. So all of that is sort of talked about as future uses and future potentials for the technology. All right, let's start by taking a look at Rodwheat and his co-authors, and the essay Ideas of Perfection and the Ethics of Human Enhancement. All right, so Rodwheat makes a distinction here between what he calls type perfection and property perfection. So type perfectionists argue that it's okay to use human enhancement as long as it remains compatible with the type that is being enhanced. So a human being would count here as a type, or a cat, or whatever the type is. So this is a sort of more limited idea, because it stipulates that you can enhance, and it's okay to enhance as long as the enhancement remains compatible with the type. So the thinking is, at some point, if you're enhancing intelligence or strength or whatever, that property is going to become incompatible with what it means to live and act as a human being. So you've sort of you've exceeded the type perfectionist constraint. So when that happens, when you're sort of exceeding the possibilities of human functionality and becoming something else, that's an excessive enhancement according to the type perfectionist criterion. Property perfectionists, on the other hand, argue that one should enhance one particular function or property regardless of how it relates to a type. So whether you focus on intelligence or strength, or whatever, property perfectionists are not particularly worried whether the enhancement goes to such a degree that it's no longer compatible with the functioning of a human being, that you can no longer sort of it no longer makes sense to perform the ordinary day-to-day tasks. So when it's incompatible with sort of living and existing as a particular type, that's when the type perfectionists say it's not justified. Property perfectionists will argue that one can keep going as long as you're enhancing a particular function or property. Now, so we'll see there may be issues with the property for perfectionists that sort of make it a problematic idea. The subjective approach to enhancement that we encounter here, there's a subjective and an objective approach, as we'll see. So the subjective approach argues that human enhancement depends on the individual's own sense of what makes type or property perfection. So there's no sort of external standard. It's really the individual's own sense of what perfection means to them and how they could achieve that form of perfection and what it would look like, or that sort of enhancement and what it means to them. And of course, one problem with that approach, with the subjective approach, is that it might lead to a form of relativism and the denial of rational discussion, right? In other words, if it's purely subjective, if we can't say anything about an individual's sense of what an enhancement means, of what, say, type perfection means to them, then it suggests that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to have a rational discussion about the value of an enhancement or any sort of series of enhancements. So relativism and the denial of rational discussion is a problem because it suggests it's going to be impossible to communicate and discuss limits and problems and difficulties. And so the subjective approach sort of, seems to take away the possibility of that sort of check on individual agency that comes from the sort of discussion and sort of rational critique. Another problem is that this idea, the subjective approach, seems to depend on at least one objective principle, the no harm principle. So you would have to say something like, you can enhance subjectively and in your subjective sense of what enhancement means, and that idea of sort of type perfection, as long as that you don't cause harm to any other person. But of course, that no harm principle then becomes an objective principle that anchors this subjective view of enhancement. So one of the things that might be an issue here is that it does actually depend on objective features, and so it's not truly subjective in any case. Now, the objective approach seems to be a better fit with type perfection since the type is necessarily shared, right? In other words, since if we're type perfectionists, we say it's permissible to enhance as long as the entity you're enhancing is notably recognizable as the type human being. Then of course we need some kind of definition of human being, and we need some kind of objective definition that we can all refer to make sure we're referring to the same thing. So when you're referring to a type and when we're using a type as a sort of basis of perfection, it makes more sense to think about the objective approach. Of course, one problem with the objective approach is that it may be difficult to reach agreement about what are objective goods, right? So the converse of the problem with the subjective approach, here it's the difficulty of reaching agreement about what is objective, about what things we should all agree on, because of course people are gonna disagree, people are gonna have subjective ideas and points of view. But perhaps we could say in response to this that maybe we all share some basic judgments that we would all agree on. For example, when we're talking about enhancement, education is a universal human good, and maybe we could all agree on that principle regardless of everything else that we disagree on. So at the limit, there may be important judgments that we all share which could anchor the objective approach. But certainly what the objective approach needs is some kind of agreement about what things are going to count as objective goods when we're talking about the things that are worth being enhanced. Now we can think of the idea of perfection. We think of enhancement. We're enhancing towards a certain idea of perfection, or better, or more perfect. However you want to say it. So perfection can be seen as a constraint or as a guiding principle on the idea of enhancement. The idea of perfection is a constraint on human enhancement when it is claimed that a good human life is defined by limitations, right? So it may be our idea of perfection includes a certain kind of limitation, not that that's a bad thing or that's a sort of negative thing, but that it sort of anchors a typical good human life, that we're limited in certain ways. So some of those things. So by sort of taking away those limitations, you would remove the idea of what it means to be human, and you would also take away something of the idea of the goodness of human life. So just to, as an example here, one of the limitations is our susceptible to injury, right? And we might say, well, if we took away human susceptibility to injury, that might sort of be a perfectionist thing. We might improve human life in that way. Except somebody might say, that the sort of the reality of injury brings about a lot of positive things in human communities. It brings about care, and it brings about a kind of communal solidarity, which otherwise wouldn't be there if we were sort of impervious to external threats. So each limitation might sort of form part of the idea of the good human life as we currently experience it. So we want to be skeptical about change that an enhancement is automatically good without seeing how it affects the sort of totality of our relations and the totality of our sort of capacities. And we'll come to that when we talk about the holistic principle. Now, perfection can also be a guiding principle to help people decide which enhancements would contribute to a good human life. So it's not constraining there, it's sort of guiding the idea of which contributions would be valuable. And if we have a sort of robust idea of what human perfection looks like, or what approaching human perfection looks like, that would be a guide to which enhancements would be worthwhile to consider. Okay, let's look at the capabilities approach. And the capabilities approach was originally founded in economics. So it comes from the discipline of economics, and it was originated and really sort of developed in the 1990s by two thinkers, Amartya Sen, an economist, and Martha Nussbaum, who was originally a philosopher. And in the 1990s, they began to develop this idea of capabilities that became very popular in thinking about, particularly thinking about the idea of human development and what it meant for different populations and different communities to kind of ascend the ladder of human development, to sort of develop in terms of their economic resources, their social and cultural resources, and so on. So in a nutshell, and for our purposes here, we can understand the capabilities approach as a theoretical framework focusing on the importance of individual well-being, which is understood in terms of capabilities. So individual well-being, whether we're flourishing in life, whether we're doing well, is understood in terms of which capabilities we're able to exercise, how developed those capabilities are, how much we're really able to sort of develop and exercise them. So it's a focus on human well-being that looks at human beings as possessors of these different capabilities. So human functioning, what we do, how we function, is conceived in terms of the realization of specific capabilities. So why is the capabilities approach important to the assessment of human enhancement? Fundamentally because the capabilities approach, as Rodewit et al. Claim, fulfills the requirement of an objective type perfection framework that can be used to both guide and limit human enhancement. Okay, so to sort of let's unpack that. The idea of an objective type perfection framework. So it's objective. It's something we can all agree on. So the claim is that these capabilities, there are central human capabilities that we would all agree are important human capabilities that, if we didn't exercise these or a significant amount of these, we would be living some kind of deficient or non-optimal human life. So the capabilities that we're supposed to agree with, we're supposed to sort of look at them objectively and discern that a human life to be well-rounded and well-lived needs these specific capabilities. And the type perfection framework, so it's the idea of a human being that's sort of captured by these capabilities and human functioning that is expressed in them. So that idea can both guide and limit human enhancement. So it can show us where we could improve human enhancement, and it could also tell us where an enhancement would go against and sort of conflict with our current functioning, if it would impede one of our capabilities, or if it would affect how the system of capabilities are linked together, then it wouldn't be a viable enhancement. So capabilities are a way of thinking about the idea of human flourishing. They tell us what it means for a human being to lead a valuable and worthwhile human life. So enhancing those capabilities can therefore lead to an enhancement of the value of a human life. So it tells us what flourishing means, and so thereby it gives us a key to thinking about which enhancements are going to be valuable and which enhancements are going to be worthwhile. So Nussbaum's list of capabilities, just to give us a sense of the kind of thing that would be involved here. So firstly, life itself, living a full life, not dying prematurely. Bodily health, of course, bodily integrity, disposing of your body as you wish, freedom from violence, and so on. The senses, imagination, and thought, so religion and art, to have a kind of sensibility for art and religion, some sort of variant of that sensibility. Emotions, to have emotional attachments, love, a life without some form of close attachment, some form of loving bond would be not optimally human. So practical reason, so our planning and form our own conception of the good life and to live that plan out. Affiliation, so social interaction to get respect and dignity from other people. So concern for other species and relations to animals and nature. Play, recreation and laughter, and control over one's environment. So, a very sort of wide-ranging list, but a sort of nice summary of things that, if we sort of thought about it, if there were, some of these that were missing, or some of these that weren't fulfilled, we could say, would somebody have an optimally satisfying life? Could we enhance human life by enhancing, some of these features, providing we didn't sort of interfere with the operation of any of the other capabilities? So these are all, so this is Nussbaum's list of key capabilities that are central to a flourishing human life. So the holistic approach says that we can't assume that it's better to try to maximize any or all of the capabilities in the list. For example, to maximize emotion over practical reason might seem like a good idea, but it might impede individuals' ability to reason. So, too much emotion and sort of overloading that side of things might disturb the balance between emotion and practical reason, and sort of upset our ability to sort of reason in a sort of calm, detached way where emotion is not really sort of playing a role. So the holistic perspective, I think, is important because it strives for harmonious relations among the sets of capabilities. So that's really the issue. So we can think about enhancement where, it may be the case that somebody is struggling with emotional connection. Could be a child or an adult who struggles with making emotional connections. That being the case, it would make sense to address that. If that's a specific kind of deficiency, maybe there's some enhancement, some sort of enhancement that could be used to do that, some kind of neurological drug or something like that. So that would be on the capabilities approach, that would be viable, as of course, as long as in doing that you didn't sort of put the whole thing out of whack. So as long as holistically everything would be the same, but this particular feature would be improved, then we can sort of think of it in that way. So we're looking for harmonious relations. We're not looking to maximize any particular specific capability. All right, let's go on to talk about the second paper this week, and it's Carl Elliott's paper, Enhancement Technologies and the Modern Self. Now, Eliot makes what I think is an interesting and plausible claim in the beginning of this article. And here he says that the source of the demand for enhancement technologies lies in the pressures and fears of ordinary American life. Right? And this is a very important claim because I think automatically we sort of led to think that enhancement is about the idea of it's a kind of striving for perfection, or it's a kind of it's an unwillingness to accept this a kind of vulnerability or lack of sort of faults and failures, and we want to sort of overcome them. However, if we take this seriously, it's not really about perfection, and it's not really trying to achieve a kind of perfection. The demand for enhancement technology seems to come from a kind of search for social acceptance. So to be able to do things that everybody else is capable of doing. Which is why, when we talk about the sort of popular enhancements, they tend to be things that drugs like Ritalin, they tend to be things that are intended to help somebody with a particular deficiency, a particular sort of functioning deficiency that makes them stand out. And the enhancement is intended to sort of allow somebody to be able to function sufficiently to gain social acceptance. So they don't sort of stand out. They don't have a stigma because of the way that they function in a particular capacity. Or of course it could be appearance as well as function, as we'll mention. So less a search for perfection than a search for a kind of social acceptance. Now, to really understand what's at stake here, we need to take up this claim that Eliot talks about in the article, and he gets all of this from Charles Taylor, as we'll see, who's a famous Canadian philosopher. And Taylor's claim here about social recognition looks at a fundamental change that happened in the late 18th century and has really been working itself out in a kind of permanent, continuous way right up to the present. And it's the collapse of a kind of accepted social hierarchy that's based on individual identity. So the collapse of social hierarchy means that today everybody must generate an identity for themselves. So identity is not sort of given by social role. And of course, this was the case before the modern age with feudalism, caste property, and a military pyramid system based on a religious concept of hierarchy, where you see different sort of scales and different categories, different classes of people who are defined not just by how rich they are or how much possessions they have, but are defined by their role, by their social identity. So knights have a kind of social identity, as do the clergy, as does the nobility and royalty at the very top of the tree, and serfs at the bottom. So if you were born a serf, it was an identity you couldn't get rid of unless there was unless your sort of social identity was officially changed by royal proclamation or whatever. So it's a social identity that stays with individuals, and it makes up who you are. Right? So it's the way those social identities have sort of disintegrated that we don't have those fixed social categories now, that's made the sort of present idea more problematic. And the claim here is that now social recognition has come to replace the idea of social hierarchy. Right? So when there's a hierarchy, it's very clear what people are and what you owe them because of because they possess a social identity. When that disappears, each individual has the task of generating their own social identity, of sort of generating social recognition for themselves, and generating that kind of respect that individuals would have sort of garnered from a kind of social identity. Now, one consequence of this is that it means the search for social recognition is always exposed to the possibility of failure, right? Because there's no guarantee that there's no sort of social role or social identity to guarantee that how you're recognized as is something viable, is how you genuinely are, that people are going to recognize you for how you want to be recognized. So there's always the chance of failure of being exposed to a recognition which is unwanted, which is unwelcome, which is stigmatizing, which is psychologically damaging. So if the image reflected back to the individual by society is demeaning or psychologically damaging, this can drive the demand for the use of enhancement technologies. So in a nutshell, that's where the push for enhancement technologies comes from, in this new sort of age where everybody's striving to be recognized, but there's no guarantee that we're going to be recognized in a way that's positive and affirming rather than demeaning. And when we can't get a positive, affirming kind of recognition, this leads to a demand for enhancement technology to sort of to allow us to get the recognition we desire. So this means, if we just follow the train of thought here, this means that enhancement technologies are essentially ways of repairing or preventing the damage of social stigma, right? And so this is the point, that they're ways of repairing, of allowing us to get social acceptance, right? So the thought is that by using enhancement technology to sort of to repair, correct, or enhance a particular feature, we will be recognized in a way that we desire, in a way that's not stigmatizing without this feature. And that would drive a sort of socially positive recognition. So enhancement technologies are sort of preventing or repairing the potential damage of social stigma on individual identity. And of course, a lot of the products that we see, the popular enhancement technologies, we can see how these, might be linked to the narrative of social acceptance. To things like early balding with men, or sort of light and dark skin, growth hormone, so the sort of social value of height and so on. Eyes and facial features, where people sort of think there's a deficiency or there's something that needs to be corrected. So all of these, I think we can see as sort of areas where the goal is a kind of social acceptance. The goal is using an enhancement to be accepted in a way that's not stigmatizing. All right, so I think we can see and we can work out pretty clearly that there's an obvious problem here, right? And the problem is that the use of these enhancements simply reinforces the social norms whose damaging effects they are intended to remedy, right? So it increases individual well-being, but at the expense of a larger social good, right? So whatever the enhancement, whether it's early pattern baldness in men, or whatever, right? So the social norm is that sort of baldness is a kind of stigma, baldness is a problem, or a kind of deficiency, right? And in using an enhancement, you would be correcting the problem, right? However, using the enhancement also confirms and reinforces the social judgment or the social norm, right? And the conversation that needs to take place here, the broader conversation, is whether the social norm is in fact, one that deserves to be followed, or one that's positive or negative, right? And we could say the same with sort of dark and light skin. We can say the same with the correction of facial features, whether it's sort of noses and eyes and sort of, ethnic facial features that are seen as kind of stigmatizing, right? Well, you can correct those using enhancement, but of course the correction might might increase individual well-being, but it does so at the expense, again, of reinforcing the norm, right? So the norm that this is how you need to look if you're going to be seen as normal, or this is what normal people look like, that norm has been reinforced, right? So there's a question here about whether that's whether that's really a good idea to do these things at the cost of a larger social good. So how do we sort of evaluate the larger cost, and how do we evaluate the importance of individual well-being here, and how do we get a critical purchase on these social norms that are sort of driving this individual desire for for transformations that win social acceptance, right? So the question here I'm asking is there a better answer rather than human enhancement to this problem? All right, so Eliot talks here about authenticity as sort of as the draw for enhancement. People who use enhancement technologies seem drawn to describe them in the language of identity and authenticity. So people who use these enhancements talk about becoming themselves. They're putting them in touch with themselves, and suggest that they're finding the true self, right? So they're seen as a kind of true self that's being brought to bear, that's being brought out through the enhancement. So it's interesting that it's the language of identity and authenticity, that people are sort of describing themselves as coming to themselves, as finding their true self in using these technologies. And the idea of being true to yourself is a fundamental principle in the modern age. And Charles Taylor wrote a book on this very idea, The Age of Authenticity, and the idea of that living a meaningful life means getting in touch with your inner depths. And we can trace this idea to the German Romantics in the 18th century, and their idea of sort of individual expressivism, that we all have these inner depths that we can express, that we can sort of bring out, that we don't necessarily show all the time, but we have these expressive depths as human beings. So this idea of sort of in bringing out our inner self, we're being true to ourselves. And so that language, Eliot notes that individuals using enhancements are sort of, whether they're this sort of using the neurological medicines and the medicines for depression and anxiety, and they're sort of talking about being able to be more authentically themselves. So that's really interesting, and a sort of interesting idea that here enhancement seems to be tapping into one of the sort of key aspirations of our modern age, of individuals sort of having this sort of sense of being true to oneself, and that being made possible through kinds of enhancements. So we can think of authenticity as a kind of ethical ideal, a kind of major ethical ideal of the modern age. It's an ethical aspiration. It's something people see as valuable and worth striving for. So a couple of points here. We can talk about the importance of originality. Each person is seen as having a unique inner voice that has something distinctive to say. So we're all original, and we all have something. We all have our own unique voice that must be sort of brought out and developed. And secondly, an authentic life is a better life. So being in touch with your feelings, desires, and aspirations has become essential to self-fulfillment. So there's this idea of being in touch with yourself and knowing your feelings, understanding your desires, and so on, that if you're sort of in touch with yourself, you can figure out more easily what self-fulfillment means. So being sort of this idea of being authentically yourself, living a life that's authentically your own, that's seen as something that's a better life. That's an aspiration for us to have, that sort of the existence that we can say is authentically our own, rather than being borrowed, rather than being sort of copied from somebody else. It's something we've sort of formed it ourselves from our own inner desires and our own inner needs and so on. So some important claims made for this idea of authenticity. Final thing here is the idea of instrumental reason, which for Taylor is a big problem in the modern age, and Eliot talks a little bit about some of this here. The desire for enhancement is seen by some critics as an expression of the drive to mastery. This would be a sort of problematic way of applying the idea of enhancement. Here it's sort of linking up with the modern idea of instrumental reason and our sort of desire to master things. So the more we are able to engineer our appearance and capacities, the more they will appear less like gifts to be accepted with gratitude and more like projects to be worked on with anxiety. So there's an idea here that the idea of instrumental reason, when we look at ourselves with this attitude of instrumental reason, we sort of shift the way we think about ourselves and our capacities. We don't see them like gifts to be accepted, but instead they're sort of projects that we have to work on, and it sort of causes anxiety all the time about whether we're working hard enough, whether we're sort of doing enough. So that becomes a very sort of mechanical and detached way of thinking about ourselves, where we sort of seen as engineering our capacities in a kind of instrumental way. And so looking at ourselves like that is very different to sort of seeing ourselves as sort of authentically expressed in our actions and so on. Here it's a kind of detached sort of calculating attitude that we adapt towards ourselves, and that causes problems when we sort of look at enhancements in this way. All right, so just to round things up, we can say that enhancement technologies may change the individual, but they are unable to fix the social problems that lie at the root of their use. So this is something that I think is going to become more important as enhancement technologies get more powerful, that eventually, we're going to have to start asking about whether they're sort of fixing problems or allowing some individuals to escape a stigma, but at the same time reinforcing the problem itself. And how do we sort of cope with that? How do we cope with that situation? How do we fix that? But certainly, I think it's certainly true that a lot of what's going on with enhancement is about fixing the problem of lack of social acceptance and social stigma, more than it's really about a kind of perfection. So does a holistic framework like the capabilities approach help us to work out when enhancement is beneficial and when it is not? And I think we can see the benefits of a kind of systematic approach like that. We don't have to agree with all the capabilities or a particular list of capabilities, but we can see that sort of forming having a sort of holistic framework, a sort of whole framework for what human properties are valuable, and how they relate to other properties, that's an important sort of idea for us thinking about how to make human enhancements a sort of viable strategy.